Shalom Talmidim. Well, here we are in our last week of this semester, but I wanted to give you one more theological reflection to conclude the semester. And it's in response to some questions that a few of you have been sending me, particularly about, I believe it was vocab words for last week, maybe the week before. Several of you noticed that the root letters in the noun lechem, which is the word for bread or for food, were the exact same three root letters in the verb to do battle or to fight or to war against, which is almost always in the nifal, and it's nilham. So you hear lechem, nilham. This interesting connection between bread and war. And so I just wanted to reflect on that for you for a moment, because I do think that there is an explicit connection being drawn between those two words, and so it behooves us to reflect on, well, what is the connection and what does it mean, which is the important thing. What does the connection mean or suggest, given Israel's relationship with war, which is a complicated one, and there are different strands of tradition throughout the biblical corpus that advocate for a different kind of relationship between Israel and war. But what's fundamentally at stake, or at least what's fundamentally being affirmed here, grammatically, within the semantic ecosystem of the language, is that there is a connection between what we eat and the wars that we make. That, let me read for you a short passage out of a book that Tom Bogart submitted an essay into. It's a wonderful book. You may have seen it before. It's called Touching the Altar, the Old Testament in Christian Worship. And it's edited by our very own Carol Bechtel. And it has several really wonderful essays in here. There's a chapter by John Whitfleet, a chapter by Tom Bogart, a chapter by Ellen Davis. I think Carol Bechtel actually has her own essay in here as well, and there are others. But Tom's essay is called Drama and the Sacred, and it's a wonderful essay, and it's a reflection on a passage from the Elisha cycle from 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 8 through 23. I call it the bands of Aram. Others call it the bands of Syria, or it could be called Elisha at Dothan, or it could be the chariots and horses and chariots of fire, whatever you want to call it. It's the story in which Elisha opens, or the Lord, through Elisha, opens the eyes of Elisha's servant, and he sees that Elisha is surrounded by horses and chariots of fire. It's this absolutely captivating and profound story. I encourage you to read it sometime. But that story itself makes a kind of implicit comment about war and food, the relationship between war and food. So at the beginning of the narrative, Aram is sieging, or is sending raiding parties into Israel, and is taking or making war with Israel. And at the very end, the last scene of the narrative is the king of Israel, who originally had wanted to kill the Aramean army, which Elisha delivered to his doorstep blind, and then revealed their sight, and they saw they were in the middle of Samaria, and the king of Israel is standing there with a bow poised, wanting to kill them. And Elisha says, no, don't kill him. Set a feast before them. So what begins with Aram and Israel at war ends with this sort of eschatological banquet feast. Elisha says, set food and water before him, but the king of Israel actually sets an elaborate feast for them, and they dine, and then they go back to their Lord, and there was no more warring between Aram and Israel, is the last phrase. So in Tom's reflection on this story, he makes this comment. The king, he's reflecting on the function or the role of kings in the ancient world. The king acted to supply what was necessary to sustain his people. His chief responsibility was to guarantee the supply of food and to wage either defensive or offensive war whenever it was threatened, it being the supply of food or water. And here he gets to the point. The close connection between war and food in the ancient world is implicit in the structure of the Hebrew language. The word for waging war, which is nilham, and the word for bread, lechem, have the same root letters, as many of you noticed. This connection suggests that the people of Israel understood war fundamentally as a means of securing bread for oneself. So there are all kinds of implications for that. One of them being, what are the appropriate circumstances within which war is an appropriate decision to, or appropriate endeavor, or an appropriate thing to participate in. But it also suggests something fundamental about war itself. What is war about? And war in the ancient world was particularly about resources, primarily food and water. But today, I think, war in many cases, at least in our context, in 20th and 21st century America, war is often about a different kind of resource. It's about an economic resource, which it was for them too, but particularly oil. Oil is what a lot of our wars on the surface, or at least beneath the surface, are about. But I was listening to a podcast recently called, I don't remember what the name of it's called. Let me look it up here. Sustainable World Radio. It's a really interesting podcast. She interviews a lot of really interesting people. And this one was an interview with a woman who had recently published a book on chickens and the role of the chicken in life. It's a really interesting podcast. Chickens are remarkable animals. But she, at the conclusion of this 50-minute podcast, the last couple of minutes, she talks about chickens and their place, or the role of food more generally, in national security. And she said this. She said that she's an American, our weakest link in terms of national security is not the threat of terrorists. It is not even our digital defense system against cyber attacks, which are getting a lot of press right now with China. Further, it's not our dependence on foreign oil. Our weakest link in terms of national security is our food and water supply. We have an elaborate infrastructure, distribution system for food and water. And if something within that system was compromised, we would be in a serious issue. I mean, she mentions that our stores, most grocery stores, have about 2 to 3 days worth of food on their shelves at any given point. They don't have stock beyond that. And so if something terrible were to happen to our distribution infrastructure, then many people in America would be in dire straits. She said there's an ancient proverb that goes like this: whoever controls your food controls you. Whoever controls your food, or your water, I think, controls you. Now, there are a lot of biblical examples of this truth working itself out. I think immediately of the story of Gideon in Judges 6. You'll remember the Midianites were oppressing the people of Israel because they did what was right in their own eyes, as the narrator says, in the time when there was no king. And so the people of Israel are weak, and the Midianites would come right around harvest time, and they would trample all of their crops so that they were completely useless. They wouldn't actually take them, they would just move huge herds onto them, camp, and completely destroy the entire crop. Well, you do this for a year or two, and things start to get really serious. The Midianites were controlling the food source of the people of Israel. I think of another story. Anytime you have siege, a siege happening on a city, what do they do first? They stop up the water supply. So if there are springs that are feeding the city with water that are outside the walls, there's all kinds of stories in the Bible about this. They would fill them with rocks, or they would somehow dump chemicals into them or something, poisons into them, and cut off all of their food trading routes. So 2 Kings 3, the story of Elisha in 2 Kings 3 in the war with Moab, when Moab sieges the city and things get so bad that there's a woman, two women living in a house, and they both have young children, and they said, today we'll eat your child and tomorrow we'll eat mine. And so they ate the one woman's child, and the next day the other woman said, no, we're not eating my child. And so the first woman went and cried out to the king and told him the story, and he tore his clothes. And Elisha said, tomorrow there will be food enough for all, and no one believed it, but the Lord came through. But here again, another thing that she said relates to this. She said that controlling the food supply and the water supply has been used as a military strategy since the beginning of time. And so we have all these examples in Scripture, but there are lots of examples in the modern day as well, that war is fundamentally about securing bread for oneself. It's about securing resources. And that connection is explicit in the Hebrew language itself. I would welcome thoughts that you might have on this. Some of you have been interacting with me around these issues already, and I welcome more interaction. I think it's a really interesting and important issue for us to consider. And the Bible has things that it can offer us as we try and figure out what does it mean for us as Christians to reflect on and talk about war. What function does it serve? What purpose does it serve? What benefits does it offer? What dangers does it hold? So I welcome more comments, but I hope that you found this helpful and to continue to think about this connection that we have in the Hebrew language.